For much of my adult life, I lived in and around the city of Boston. Now, Boston, like New York and most other cities, is filled with hundreds of wonderful parks. Often on Friday afternoons, I would find myself in the Boston Common, no doubt one of the more famous and beautiful open spaces in the city, designed, as many of you may know, by Frederick Law Olmsted. While I always had a book in hand, more often than not, my attention was drawn to the diverse mass of humanity passing by. You know, old-fashioned people watching. On the Common, you saw all sorts of people. The stately Brahmin woman walking home from the Boston Public Library with her book under her arm on her way towards Beacon Hill. Young college students sitting in circles on the grass, laughing or debating. Then there were street artists of all stripes, the juggler, the woman with the guitar, the guy with the sax. Then you'd have the occasional street corner evangelist preaching about the impending apocalypse. That was always like the jackpot to get one of those. And of course, the vast homeless population for whom the Common was home. In today's gospel, we find Jesus engaged in a bit of old-fashioned people watching. The temple was the closest thing to a city common that you could find in first century Jerusalem. It was the arrival and departure place for much of life in the city. Jesus notices all sorts of people. He notices pilgrims coming in from all regions, there to give worship and sacrifice to God. In the back of his mind, he remembers the time when he came with his parents and how he got lost and how angry they were when they finally found him 3 days later. And there's that faithful band of women. They're always over there in that corner praying. There's the guy at the booth changing money and the temple guard keeping an eye on things. Dotted among the crowd are the elite of Jerusalem, people of wealth, and also some scribes. Now, the scribes are the official interpreters of God's law. I mean, super huge power in a scribe. You know, they get the last word. Think Supreme Court justice. Interestingly, scribes are not wealthy. They survive on stipends offered them by the temple. However, they do enjoy tremendous influence. And when they walk through the temple, they do so with panache and flair. They are well clad in reds and golds and greens. They are distinguished in the crowd. They are impossible to miss. They are the ones to notice. And then there is this poor widow putting her last few bits into the temple coffers. If you've ever seen the musical Chicago, you may recall this number. Cellophane, Mr. Cellophane. Should have been my name, Mr. Cellophane, because you can look right through me, walk right by me, and never know I'm there. She is the one that everyone walks right through, and you'd never know she was there. She is poor. She has nothing material to contribute to society. She is prey to those who would take advantage of her. Yet Jesus can't take his eyes off of her. She is compelling. It's sort of like when the sun catches a beautifully woven spider's web in just that right way, and it sort of entrances you. This woman dropping into the temple treasury 2 lepta coins worth less than a penny finds Jesus entranced. He notices her, and then he calls his disciples over to notice her too. He said, "Truly I tell you, this woman, this poor widow, has put more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put everything she has in, all that she had to live on." Now here's the irony. The temple treasury to which she has just given her all, was there to help people like her. In the law, in the Torah, in the soul of Jewish spiritual life, there are hundreds of admonitions for Israel to care for the poor and the lowly, the widow, the orphan, the vulnerable. Love God with all your heart. Love your neighbor as yourself. And love the alien in your midst, because you were once aliens in the land of Egypt. It was the work of the temple leaders, like the scribes, to ensure that the money from the treasury was used for people like her and all those who had become of no consequence in society. Except Jesus knows that's not been happening. They've been skimming off the top for years. They've been skimming off the middle. They've been skimming off the bottom. Money's not being used to help the vulnerable. It's being used to keep the scribes well clad and in those places of honor at important banquets. She held nothing back, gave it all away. But what Jesus knows is that she's being trapped in a scam, an instance of elder abuse right here in the house of God. And what does Jesus do? Nothing. There's no miracle. There's no teaching moment. There's no experience of transformation. There's no pick up your mat and go, your faith has made you well. Is it possible that Jesus just sort of hangs his head down in between his legs and just shakes his head in a moment of hopelessness, crushed by the reality of such great poverty and such little love? And then here's the hard thing. Jesus gets up and walks out the door. And there the gospel ends. But here the story continues. He leaves the temple, and you kind of got to flip the page to the beginning of Mark chapter 13. And you have to keep reading, because you can't just take a snippet of a story to understand what Jesus is about. And when you flip that page, you see Jesus standing outside the temple with his disciples. And the disciples, sort of looking at the temple, say, "What a magnificent building, really, isn't it?" And Jesus says, "You see that building? Not one stone will be left upon another. It will all be thrown down." Indeed, the Romans will sack the temple and destroy it around 70 AD. But Jesus is not really talking about the building. He's referring to the community of God's people. He stands there with that woman's heart of courage etched into his heart, and he begins to offer renewal and transformation for the community of God's people. The community needs new cornerstones. The cornerstones of Deuteronomy need to be reestablished. Those cornerstones of love and compassion and generosity and neighborliness. Jesus has come to help Israel see again who they are and to free them up to live once again as God's beloved community. Jesus uses his sphere of influence to get the people of his time to rethink what it means to be God's people. He gave his life that we might begin to find our way back home to each other, to what it means to be a human being, to reconnect us to the mercy and love that is hardwired within us all. He will give everything that he has for this mission, even his life. And so, friends, where are the temples you find yourselves flowing in and out of? Where do you go, people watching? Who are the invisible poor that walk right by and you don't see them? The ones that we look right through day in or day out? Is it the work colleague who is just a few cubicles over, who is quietly devolving before everyone's eyes? Is it the lost kid that blends in with the tiles at school? Is it the illiterate youth in communities not too far from here who are facing a life of poverty? Is it the neighbor to your left who is weighed down by depression and you have no clue that that's going on? Is it the family that is unraveling before our eyes? Is it the women behind the Starbucks counter that I meet every single Sunday morning? Is it the person beside you? Is it you? Is it me? A few of us have just completed reading the Book of Joy, and it's a book that you can't complete reading it. You read it once through and you have no clue really what you just read. You have to put it down and keep going back because there's so much in there. It is inspired life wisdom by Archbishop Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama. The common theme throughout the book is this: if you want to find joy in your life, if you want to find meaning, if you want to find that deep well of life in God, it begins when we turn to each other with compassion. It begins when we see each other for the human beings that we are, looking at each other with love and recognizing that every single person that we meet has something going on in their lives and we have no clue. It is that turn, it is that seeing the one who is invisible before our eyes with the eyes of God's love. That is where the path to joy begins. Jesus saw a woman dropping 2 bits into the temple treasury. She gave all she had, and he saw her. He sees us, he sees you with love and with steadfast mercy. He calls us to go and do the same.